Chapter 22. On the morning the judges were supposed to look over the gardens, Sumiko still hadn't told Mr. Moto that she'd entered them in the contest. She was sitting at the table in her barrack, getting up the courage to go tell him, when someone knocked at the door. "Come in," she called out. It was Mr. Moto. "I thought you might want to come outside," he said. She walked slowly to the door, then stopped and blurted out, "I entered us in the contest." She thought he might be angry, but instead he laughed. "Well, I entered us also." They took down the cheesecloth so the judges could get an unfettered view of the garden. Sumiko cleaned up all the spent wheat flowers, since there was nothing uglier than a spent wheat flower. She got ice water in case the judges were hot, and she and Mr. Moto moved the crickets and snakes away in case any of the judges didn't like such things. They brought out a few chairs for the judges to sit on under a cheesecloth tent Mr. Moto had erected. And then they waited. Sumiko didn't tell anyone, but she even wrote out a little speech in case they won first prize, and someone asked them to say a few words. Sumiko looked at the garden. Mr. Moto had built 2 long ledges on one side and let some kind of vine fall over the ledges. That way their garden looked almost tropical, here in the desert. And Sumiko had gone through her flower forest and cut off a flower here and there, so that the stalks were different heights in some places. She felt this gave the impression that the flowers were wild and not cultivated. And the topper for the whole garden were the long pieces of wood that Mr. Moto had carved into perfect facsimiles of bamboo. When the judges came around, a number of people from the block stood around to watch. There were 7 judges. Some of them knelt down and looked closely at the plants, while others stood far back to get more perspective. They all took notes on pads of paper. Nobody drank any ice water, and nobody sat under the cheesecloth tent. And nobody asked a single question. After a few minutes, the judges smiled stiffly and left. Mr. Moto and Sumiko looked at each other. "Well, anyway, I think it's a beautiful garden," he said. Then he hung his head sadly. "Too bad we have no trees." His face grew even sadder. "Sakagami-san? His miniature sailboats in his pond?" Sumiko felt disappointed and even jealous of Mr. Sakagami. That day the paper carried an item about an Indian basketball team from the local high school coming to camp after dinner to play against the Camp 3 All-Star basketball team. The All-Stars had never played together before. Still, it was a big event. The Indians had played in Camps 1 and 2 before, but this was their first trip to Sumiko's camp. The paper said that the Indians had been told to stay away from the Camp 3 girls. When Sumiko read the article, she suspected it was written just for her by someone who somehow knew that she knew Frank. She realized her suspicion was ridiculous, but she couldn't stop herself from feeling that way. The basketball court was dirt that had been sprayed with water to create a hard pack. Everybody in camp was curious to see the Indian team. In the early evening, there was a silence when the Indians stepped off their bus. The Indians and the Japanese looked at each other curiously. Sumiko followed in a crowd of kids as the Indians walked to the court. The Indians were taller than most of the Japanese players, except for the Japanese center, a boy who actually had to duck when he entered doorways. But on a good day, he was about as fast as a turtle. Though the Indians and the Japanese seemed curious about each other, Sumiko didn't know if they liked each other. They seemed to want to stay separate. She could tell by how they stood at a distance when they looked at each other. The Indians all wore their hair short, not long like in pictures, and their names were either Anglo or Spanish. Sumiko had thought Frank and his friends might have been unusual since they all wear their hair short, but so did these older boys. The Japanese were fast and pesky, and the game stayed close. The crowd cheered wildly for the All-Stars, but the Indians won by 3 points. After the game, a Japanese girl was talking to one of the Indian players when all of a sudden a Japanese boy stepped between them and said warningly, "You stay away from our girls." Sumiko recognized the boy. He lived on the same block as her. She worried what would happen if he found out she knew Frank. Before the player could reply, the center for the Indian team came over and said, "He's not interested in your girls." "What's wrong with our girls?" said the Japanese boy. He tried to push the Indian center, but the Japanese center held him back. Members of both teams had been shaking hands with each other. Now there was a silence like the silence at the party when Sumiko had walked into the living room. It rolled across the crowd the same way. A moment ago, everybody had seemed happy to have played a great game, but now both teams were glaring at each other. Then Bull was there, slapping the boy on the shoulder and saying, "There's nothing wrong with our girls." He reached out to shake hands with the Indian center. "Great game. We'll get you next time." The center hesitated but nodded, and people started to disperse. Later, Sumiko saw a couple of boys about Tak-Tak's age following the girl who'd talked to the Indian. The boys were saying, "Indian lover," and pulling at her skirt as she walked with her head high. Ichiro always said that holding your head high was a sign of dignity. Seeing the boys taunt the girl shook Sumiko up, because she was starting to think Frank wasn't so bad. In fact, she almost liked him. If people pulled at her skirt and called her names, she wondered if she would have the courage to hold her head high like that girl. Whenever she thought of having friends, she thought about how they would act toward her. Now she saw that if she and Frank were friends, she had responsibilities. When she got home, she found something hanging on her door. A yellow ribbon. 3rd place! She grabbed the ribbon and ran into Mr. Moto's barrack, forgetting for a moment about the day's events. "Congratulations," he said. He slapped her on the back. "I cooked you up some snake."